trivial. In the present context, I have been commissioned by the organizers to play this role of raising questions about your work. Because I think that questioning, not merely argumentation or giving logical argument, what is the pinnacle of inquiry, which was there in the classical time with the advent of Buddhism, is debates. There were no debates before Buddhism. There were only aphoristic, statements which are taken or left. They were aphoristic. Okay, there is an inquiry. Inquiry is not debate. There are inquiry, there are followers, there are questions, there are dialogues, there are not debates. It is Buddhism that brought the very important genre called debating. In a debate, the truth does not lie either with this side or that side. It lies with the outside. So there are two people debating, and then win and lose is a different thing, but you know who is doing well. Okay, so that I thought that is one of the important points, crucial in classical Indian philosophy, which somewhere got lost, and I will come to it, how it got lost and what happened here. So let me, after saying how she has contributed to people outside history, let me now get into a philosopher student's reading of a historical work. I'm very clear because I know I'm as inhibited more inhibited than you to speak about history, because I'll tell you the reason why I'm inhibited. Okay, but let me start. Next. You're perhaps one of the earliest to identify the limitations of seeing India as a wonder. But only in the past that India was a wonder. There is a tense that is at work. In making a case for studying ancient Indian history, you made a subtle but enormously significant move in locating this task not outside Western scholarship, as is the case with your teacher and other Indologists, but right at the center of their own scholarship. The scholarship that they claim is universal. For instance, you begin your chapter, Ideology and the Interpretation of Early Indian History, the first one in your book interpreting early Indian history, by placing the problem, I quote, within the interpretations of the ancient periods of history. That's the most important thing. Not placing it within the readings of ancient Indian history. And at that time you point out, very rightly, how they looked at their own past because of advent of modernity. I think no philosopher in India had this insight. If that was there, we would have had a different reading of the West. And you are perhaps the first one to make this very genuinely perceptive point that it is the modernity that made the West to look at their own history the way in which they are looking at it. I think that really sums up the entire enterprise, and it gives you a wonderful different reading of Western history from Indians' point of view. Somebody would, I would like to maybe, if there is an occasion to look at it, how this is one of the instance of a Swarajyan ideas outside K.C. Bhattacharya's paper, if I am allowed to make that comment. So that's this is the need for ancient history. The need to look at ancient Indian history is not because of we are the different, we are the wonder, but then along with in the same banquet as is happening to Western history of their own ancient period. I think it is a seminal idea that even historians needs to look at it. Publishers of your book has to look at it. I'll come back to that personal thing later. Okay, because they just try to, this is the claim, this is what you started. But how you are received, sometimes you are received within the South Asian studies, which I think is not doing justice. I'll come back to that point if there is a time, at the end. This very first sentence of this chapter makes the claim. I sat with this sentence for a long time, for a very, very long time. I visit this paper that when Nikhil asked me to do this job, I said, please allow me to confine to these 2 seminal papers. They stayed with me. I read them more times than maybe I wanted to spend the same time to reading your other books, but that's the seminal kind of contribution that stayed with me. I revisit this again and again every year. That is, the very first sentence of this chapter makes the claim that ancient Indian history should be studied in the same way as Western or world scholarly approaches to history. That is, the study of ancient Indian history is not esoteric, nor does it thrive on discounts. It is similar to that of, or on par with, the engagement in the West that have also shown little interest in the historiography of their own ancient periods. Your contribution helped elevate the study of ancient history to the level of Western history or a universal concern for history. Further, you have related the works of those scholars who are, in quotes, well disposed towards India, not merely to their objective interest in India and its past, but to their attempt at seeking an escape into the Ethiopia, a distance in time and space, perhaps fleeing from the bewildering changes overtaking them in their own countries. I think it is another important capturing of a torrential phenomena that's going on there in few lines. And I, again, at the cost of being very arrogant, I think this line is not picked up by the subsequent discussion. People within history and outside, I don't know much about people within history, but at least from outside, that this is the punchline of stated long back. Okay, so these are the 2 points that I want to make here. As a student of philosophy, I see this as both foundational and profitable. I make this claim in relation to earlier studies on India, which have attempted to study India outside the protocols of Western scholarship. In contrast, see the predicament of Indian philosophy, which even today remains in the balconies of religious studies and is not admitted within the departments of philosophy in the West. Further, we have sent a clear message that this need not necessarily relapse into provincialism or a glorification of the past. So you have a problem with the outside, you also have a problem with the inside, and I think you have really made us, you have seen, I agree with Sundar that you are a conscience keeper, but you are also a great alerter, and the kind of terrain that you have laid is very, very productive, less dangerous, and more, profitable. Is it okay? Can I? Yeah, okay. Let me now make my own stage in the discipline that I come from, philosophy. I think philosophically there is a relation between experience, thinking, and expression. That all that we experience, we may not, think. We may think more outside experience, or less of experience, or more of experience, but there is no equivalent between my experiences, my thoughts, and my language are not in symmetrical relation. Never can they be in symmetric relation. There is a fundamental, human, inevitable, enigmatic asymmetry amongst these 3 domains. Now, I think that a similar exercise I did it in. The history is a subset of past, and past is a subset of time, because there is a time has temporality, 3 important domains which are there. So, as a student of philosophy, the notion of time in Indian systems is very, very complicated. Somewhere along the way, one needs to process the historical material about the ancient Indian history through the epistemological categories of these notions. I'll come back to it later. Just let me make this point and then come back to it. Let me now start criticizing you with your permission. This is the strategy of taking permission from Bhishma to attack you. And okay. While this is an enormous contribution, let me, however, point out that the approach that you created has now become warped, since it has been forced to respond to right-wing versions, which are either softer or more hardcore versions of the past. In highlighting the problems of the right-wing attempts at appropriating a singular past, you did not find time to look at the India that is a wonder, not that was a wonder, that is a wonder. The wonder in the present tense, despite the threat to pluralism from the right wing, lies in the way 19th and 20th century India continues to negotiate the West, the outside, conceding to the modern, yet not completely surrendering, changing, yet maintaining difference and identity. Even if not substantially grand, thinkers from these centuries have come up with combinations that are different and unprecedented. The synthesis of the matter and the spirit, the way in which Indian democracy is sustained by aspects of the pre-moderns, thus rejecting the modern Western idea that democracy is sustained by the modern idea of citizen, where, for instance, further, where cities contain within themselves several villages, which is not the case in the West. Instead, the discussion and the focus has largely been on the negative aspects of communalism. Thus, while you succeeded in taking the different stands compared to either studies on India, earlier studies on India, however, the ground that you gained too relapsed into the Indologist domain in one respect, namely, that is, you too, like them, did not bother about the interesting aspect of the present. This is important for me as a modern student of India, as modern Indian thinkers, while experimenting, this is Gandhi, and discovering, this is Nehru, India highlighted some distinguishing aspects, both good and bad. What we have in front of us is an epic social reality that is waiting to be made into an epic. Perhaps the war that was made out to be an epic by Vyasa may not have been so big an event. A war where only a few continents participated passes off as a world war. In comparison, India is a site where two civilizations, India and the West, came in contact, though the contact begins in the form of colonialism. Unlike the West, where modernity succeeded in disinheriting the pre-modern, in contrast, in India, both the pre-modern and modern are locked in mutual contestation with each other. It is not conclusive whether the outside is eroding the inside or the inside is co-opting the outside or both. This makes this phenomena greatly interesting. There is a need to capture the complexity of this unique social phenomenon. Notwithstanding the uniqueness of modern India, your writing did not pay attention to this aspect, while conceding that this perhaps was necessitated by the increasing dominance of the right wing. However, it should be noted that modern India of this period was caught in the protocols of the crisis management. It is true that the nationalist historiography gave rise to or was replaced by the form of militant Hinduism, as you rightly pointed out, which in turn gave rise to quote, communal atmosphere in Indian politics in the late 1930s and 1940s. However, unquote, in the writings of thinkers like Vivekananda, Aurobindo, Gandhi, this is also accompanied by the internal criticism. These thinkers were critical of the evil of or in Indian society, which foregrounded their attempt to make a case for Swaraj. They have acknowledged the contribution, though not consistently, of both Islam and British. This ordering in their concern, if paid a little attention, would have presented a possibility where one could avoid a communal version of nationalism, but a nationalism that seeks autonomy while learning from the outside. In this context, one can concede that the attempt of these historiographers may have been necessitated by the contextual requirements of making a case for India's independence. This would not only provided a better understanding of their work and their context, but it would have also isolated the right wing and insulated them from the nationalist historiographers. Further, is it possible to struggle for independence without unity, even though there are imbalances and disproportions? I'm saying that there is a need to look at this possibility. In this context, it would have been better. It would have made better sense if one distinguished intentionality of nationalist historiographers that you rightly critiqued from the consequences of their theories. Finding fault with the latter could have parked their intentionality outside the domain of these undesirable consequences. I'm raising this point because Unlike many whose interest in the ancient is not related to the contemporary, you are one of the few from India, though this is pervasive in the Western scholarship. For instance, see the works of Lévi-Strauss, Gadamer, Ricoeur, Derrida, Foucault, who evoke the contemporary in the context of studying ancient periods. So this is my first submission. A second submission is, you have rightly identified the problem surrounding the interpretation of Indian society as unchanging. You have explicated the underlying political interest of colonial scholarship that depicts Indian society as unchanging. However, what has not been undertaken is exploring the place of permanence. One could have asked, theoretically, what if a society is unchanging? What is great thing about change? Why are you absolutizing the virtues of change? What if I say I don't want to change? This time we could have asked that question, and I'm not saying that then endorse permanence, but I think we should have come up with a counterfactual of saying that if you don't change, then this happens. So you should change. That I think we should have had 1 minute or a second, which would have given accrued us different way of analyzing things. What is wrong with change? The second question does not intend to endorse the view that Indian society is unchanging, but aim to explore the nature of the idea of permanence. In other words, there is a need to distinguish descriptions from normative endorsement. What I describe need not be endorsed by me. Okay, I describe something and I may not endorse that. Or, since I describe it, I don't endorse it. In other words, there is a need to distinguish descriptions from normative endorsements. Exploring the nature of permanent need not tantamount to endorsing it. While you are right in correctly and systematically presenting the limitations of depicting India as an unchanging society, it would have thrown different light if one explored the counter ontologies available in India. In this context, let me point out that Buddhism proposed an idea of change, a continuous change. Though this is different from the idea of change proposed by the modern West, we could have said, what is an idea of change in Buddhism and how is that related to understanding Indian society, which allegedly is static or unchanging? We didn't use this internal resources as much as we should have done. Bringing this into the discussion would have thrown a better light in the nature of change as seen by the West, according to which Indian society is depicted as unchanging. Okay, this is my second, submission. Just 10 more minutes. My third submission is, you have presented a critique of those developments, I quote, which was the parent to the present-day syndicated Hinduism, which is being pushed forward as the sole claimant to the inheritance of the indigenous Indian religion, unquote. In this context, you used an argument where you claim that the origin of the word Hindu is geographical and related to those living in the Indian subcontinent. The Sindhu, in brackets, Indus, river was referred to as a Hindu by the Achaemenian Persians and as the Indos by the Greeks, unquote. You find this problematic as you argue that the, I quote, call to unite under Hinduism as a political identity is anachronistic. Let me, by way of thickening the plot, as it were, bring into discussion more positive aspects of the act of the other, an outsider, designating by name the inside. Ramchandra Gandhi, my teacher, when referring to this issue says, and I quote, "What is India? Of course it is a place. Many Hindus worry about that others gave us the name, India. Indians, we don't have this name. We ought not even call ourselves Hindus because that arises from the same word from the river Indus," unquote. He looks at this differently from you, perhaps unlike you, when he says, and I quote, "But that's marvelous name. We ought to be eternally grateful to the Malaysians, to the outsiders, foreigners, for having given us this beautiful name. The name of a river. The name reminds us that our identity is the identity of a river. What is the identity of a river? The river always seeks the ocean. That is what an Indian is. Any human being who seeks the ocean, the vast, the infinite, and is willing to make the supreme risk of entering that ocean and apparently ceasing to be that river is an Indian. That is what Indian spirituality is. This is the lectures on Indian spirituality that he gave at California University of Integral Studies, unquote. So this is another way of looking more positively at this act of having the name given by an outsider. Further, at a more philosophical level, what is given by an outsider is a name and not a reality. That's the point that I make against Balagangadhara. So the issue that you are referring to in this essay is about the name and not the reality. To extend this issue further, while agreeing with you that the word Hindu is of recent origin and extending it to the distance past is anachronistic, it must be recognized that the West too is as recent as early 20th century. According to Oxford English Dictionary, the use of the word West other than as an adverb, as a noun or as an adjective is, to quote a later development, that gained currency during the Great War, although the immediate source of such usage has not been established. Incidentally, it is Spengler who uses the word West in his title, The Decline of the West. Before that, the use has it's not very sure that. So to say that Aristotle or Russell are Western philosophers is like, as I said in the last meeting, is like saying that I was present for my mother's wedding in the patriarchal setting, not now. Okay. I also wanted to now bring in two important importances of the other. Let me take this question about the self and the other and how the other has designated self. Now, for instance, you have in our enthusiasm. This is not about you, but generally, let me just say they make this comment about those people like K.C. Bhattacharya and others who want to look at the outside as a slavery and inside is a Swaraj, as if the inside is the monopoly of Swaraj and outside is the monopoly of slavery, and in between, they make some small here and things like that. I wanted to say that I think it is very important for another. Even if another is exploiting me, enslaving me, I still want to retain that other. If Buddhism as another was not there at that time, India would not have been a civilization, and we would not be writing anything about this country or this region. It is Buddhism as another that brought a dialogical tradition where people could talk to each other. That actually culminates into what we call loosely as pluralism. So let me look at this thing in this. Let me give you two incidents. One day, in a college where Vivekananda was studying, there was a teacher who was teaching them Shakespeare's notion of trance, and they were not getting it properly. And the teacher goes to the principal, who was Reverend Hasty, and complains, saying that these boys from Bengal don't know how to read, Wordsworth's poetry, and they don't understand. So he stamps his boards and then walks out. Reverend Hasty, listen to it carefully. Reverend Hasty, not that you are not listening to it carefully earlier. Reverend Hasty comes to the class and says, I heard that you are not following your teacher's lecture on the trance in Wordsworth. Perhaps your teacher himself may not know what is an idea of a trance in Wordsworth. That's very important. Okay, if you are interested in knowing what is a notion of trance, go and meet this person in Dakshineshwar called Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. Please remember that it is the other, a Britisher, and he is a Christian. He is a priest telling these Bengali boys not about something from Britain, but what they did not see in their own place. Look at one religion to the other religion, and now you know what is the impact of Ramakrishna Paramahamsa on Vivekananda. We may not accept what Vivekananda is doing, but look at the impact business. Okay, that is what I think. So look at the enormous contribution of the other. Now you, because of this Swaraj, or a very converted version of Swaraj, you wanted to just destroy this one wonderful, repository of knowledge. I would think that I am ready to be in servitude for 200 years. I know it is a big ambitious thing. If I get something like this, let me just add one more example. Just 5 minutes before that. Gandhi. We talk about Gandhi in Swaraj, Swaraj in Swaraj and all that. Gandhi was asked by 2 theosophical people in England about Gita, and he said, I felt ashamed that I did not read Gita. And then they tell him that you must read Gita, and he said that I don't have a copy. Okay, so then both of them get him Gita in translation, which is Light of Asia by Arnold, and he reads Gita in translation in English, prompted by 2 British in England. And you see the impact of Gita on him. So you want to destroy this other, which is very, very important resources. So I thought that I will just bring that. So I think that the other need not be mere an oppressor, even though he is politically oppressing me. I can still, while undergoing this oppression, still project the other as a teacher. I myself as a student and other as a teacher. Learn even in suffering. I think learning in suffering is great, because I find that there is something very interesting, morally I may not endorse slavery, but there is something interestingly, architecturally about slavery. Look at the Tale of Two Cities, Dickens. You remember, if you read that, is a thing, that there is a hierarchy between the master and the slave during that time. Okay, and the king or whatever, duke or whatever it is, he throws coins because he killed his cart killed the person. Now he throws coins clumsily, but the slave receives it, throws it back. But there is a clarity in the slave. There is also very tidiness in the slave. The untidiness is in the master. Okay, I think I am interested in recognizing the tidiness of and clarity the slave has, even in those situations where his morality is undermined and he is completely mutilated and he is completely looked down, and all that wretchedness. I quite agree with you. But even in the context of this wretchedness, which is ugly, I still wanted to pay attention to these 2 important structural aspects of slave being tidy, slave being clear. I think that's very important, and I don't think Indians during national struggle, had that capacity. Okay, let me just get into the next point. You rightly evoke pluralism and highlighted the virtues of plural character of Hinduism. To quote, you said that, I quote, perhaps the major aspect of what we call Hinduism of the pre-modern period was that it was not a uniform monolithic religion, but a juxtaposition of flexible religious sects. This flexibility was its strength and its distinguishing feature, while this flexibility was its strength and its distinguishing feature, allowing the injunctions of the Dharma Shastras, which nevertheless had to be included within the definition of what has been called Hinduism, unquote. While this is important, however, what remains unsatisfactory is that you almost exhaust the idea of pluralism to combat communalism, thus restricting the use of the assets of pluralism to the negative domain and have made use of the positive aspects of pluralism. For instance, the plural society makes it difficult to use terms like majority and minority. Seriously speaking, if some society is plural, it cannot allow the use of majority and minority. Okay, that I think they don't go well. So either you say society is plural and then stop talking about majority and minority, or you say when you start using majority and minority, then you should not use the pluralism. They are mutually exclusive. The plural society provides a rare opportunity for everyone to feel a sense of being a minority. So these positive sides of pluralism remain explored in your work. Let me give you an example. Now we talk about there is a majority. Yes, there is a majority, or there is a majority in the making. But was there a majority? Even till I asked. I was a student at IIT Kanpur. I was a male. I have a Hindu and an upper caste name, Raju, and things like that. But when I went first time there, in that cold winter December, and everybody was speaking Hindi, I felt I'm a minority. I'm just a minority. Now I think that since if some society is plural and if India is plural, one important positive aspects of this country is it gives or forces everyone to feel the sense of minority. And with the feeling of the sense of minority, you understand not minority. Make no mistake about it. I'll be inconsistent. The other. So, this is the positive aspects of pluralism, which should not be just used, to combat communalism. One more point, or maybe I take that point since the time is.
How much time you want?
5 minutes.
Sure.
Now, I think there is a textual problem about reading your work. I find that you do bring Nilakanta Shastri's work from, in talking about South India. But I think that that work, sometimes looks as if it is an appendix to your work. Okay, because it dominantly, takes real complexities from the North India. Let me just make this point, in contrast to. Imagine a situation where Rajaji was not there in the freedom struggle. With all the problems of caste, associated with Rajaji, South India wouldn't have got integrated into the freedom struggle the way in which it got integrated. I'm not from this saying that it got integrated in a positive sense. The way in which it got integrated, it would have been slightly like the Northeast relation to Indian freedom struggle. So I'm saying that I thought that somewhere along the way you do refer to Nilakanta Shastri, but I think a more positive and a very foundational kind of engagement with that kind of work or that history would have really brought in more energy into this kind of thing. So though I have raised these questions, I strongly feel that some of us can work the way we do only because of those like you. In that sense, your contribution is foundational and fundamental. You are, to evoke Foucault, an author of discursivity. I find those like you stretching beyond South Asian studies. I strongly hold that your contribution is to international scholarship. Thus, I would like to traverse a larger ground that claimed previously and maintain that your work is a part and a prominent aspect of global scholarship. For instance, I would claim in this context that your work has to necessarily overlap with sociology or literature, as unlike in the West, where the past is disinherited by modernity and is quarantined in libraries, galleries, museums. The pre-modern coexist in contrast with modern in India. This difference is in the object of the study by those eminent scholars like you should be claimed not merely as contributing to South Asian studies, but to global scholarship. That's why I think that, I find when, something came to me, where I looked at and they said that, Professor Romila Thapar's contribution to South Asian scholarship, I thought that they have not read the first line that I quoted, properly. I think we have to be very, very careful. What is claimed by you is not received. Only a discounted and a part caricature is there. And that is the greatest, greatest weakness, flaw in your readers. And I think there is a need to take what you claim. There is a need to interrogate with you, but I think it is a great damage to discount or not pay attention to your claims and the way at the level on which you have kept the discussion and bring it down to the South Asian. I think it is I can't express that. You understand my emotion. So let me so there is a variance between what you kept the discussion, the way it was received, and then I'm saying that there is a need for students of philosophy in India to use the different notions of space and time and relook at the Indians' past. Not because we also have a history, but what is it that we are seeing in the past? Okay, so I thought that these words, I thank again Nikhil, Gayatri and Sundar and you for, I'm very tense in saying these things. Thank you.
I think one of the most important aspects of relating history to the social sciences lies in the discussions that some of us have been trying to push, which is the discussions on historiography. History, after all, is the product of individual historians in conversation with each other, and sometimes in battle with each other, and sometimes not in conversation with each other. But anyway, it is the product of people's thinking, individual thinking about particular subjects. And I think that in our historical studies, at least, in departments of history, there is not nearly enough emphasis on the study of historiography, on explaining to up-and-coming historians that the first thing they really have to look at is the question of who is writing what and why, what is the background. So let me try and make a few comments on some aspects of historiography that were picked up in this discussion, and that might, in a sense, illuminate some of the others. I don't know. Let me begin with the last point, South Indian history. You're quite right. South Indian history is in many ways, in my first book, let me say, my first general history, it is in many ways a kind of appendix. And the remarkable thing is that when this first book, The History of India, came out in 1966, a number of people commented on the fact that, thank God, there's something on South India as well, because the histories that had existed earlier, from Vincent Smith onwards, focused solidly on South India. And even now, there isn't really enough. And I'll tell you what my problem was. My problem was, A, that I was a product of early 20th century historiography, in which the perspective of Indian history was the Ganges plain. That was what was the heart and soul of India, and the rest was all peripheral. This got corrected in my thesis and my first book, which I'm interested to see that nobody has picked up that first book, which I think is really pretty important in terms of my own development, Ashoka and the Decline of the Mauryas. My study of Ashoka has not been referred to in at least the papers I've been sent, and that intrigued me enormously. But anyway, when I was working on this, then I realized that in fact, although he excludes what we call the far south, the Chora Chera Pandyas, because he dismisses them as being really chiefdoms rather than states, and he was really not in a position to, he wasn't very anxious to go to war against them or conquer them or anything of that kind. Nevertheless, there is a consciousness that there is territory south of the Narmada which is important to the North Indian polity. And this made me very aware of the fact that we so seldom study the polity south of the Narmada, south of the Vindhyas. There is a kind of boundary there. And I tried to correct this in my first History of India in 1966. The problem, of course, was that I didn't know Tamil. And instead of doing what a really good scholar would have done, which is to say, right, I will take 2 years off and I will sit and learn classical Tamil and start reading the texts, I was lazy. I depended on translations. And I realized that you cannot make generalizations with great confidence if you're reading translations. Because even if you're basing yourself on a translation, when it comes to a crucial point, you have to go back to the original and you have to understand how it is articulated in the original. To the extent that one did things like, if there was a very complicated text and you weren't really quite sure, in Sanskrit, and you weren't quite sure what was being said, one did go to scholars of philosophy and philology and so on and say, what are the variant readings of this? And discuss it with them. Later on, linguistics. A lot of the work that I did, for example, I did discuss with people like Professor Krishnamurthy in Hyderabad, because I had absolutely no understanding of Dravidian linguistics, and yet I realized that it was extremely important to the way in which one was looking at texts. So yes, there is in the earlier material, and then later on, of course, I realized that unless I did it the hard way and sat and learnt classical Tamil, there was no point in my trying to extend my knowledge to that area as well. Secondly, I think that if one has anything worthwhile to say, it is incumbent upon the scholar to really focus. Focus not by saying that what I'm saying about this region, whether it's North India or whether it's the Ganges Plain, is relevant to the whole of the subcontinent. But focus in the sense of, these are the questions that I'm asking for this region, given this kind of historical inclination that I have. These same questions can be asked of other regions and you can get different answers. And that realization that you can ask the same questions and get different answers is both disturbing if you're writing a history of the subcontinent, because you say, well, where do I stop? Where do I put a geographical boundary on what I'm doing? Because, you get to the point where you start saying you're talking about the Kushans and the Shakas and the Gandhara experience, and that takes you into Afghanistan, it takes you into Bactria, and then you start saying, well, I have to learn Bactrian Greek in order to understand these texts. And it is endless, because the subcontinent is not bounded. And even if you take the subcontinent as a unit, you have to extend yourself much further as a historian in every direction. And now, these days, of course, one has moved from treating the Ganges Plain as the heartland to treating the whole of the landmass of the subcontinent as the heartland, to now realizing that there is a whole Indian Ocean perspective that comes and has a bearing on the subcontinent. So what do you do with that Indian Ocean perspective? Because that does, again, bring up Greek and Latin sources, Arabic sources, sources in Old Javanese and Khmer and those languages of Southeast Asia. So it's really very difficult. I mean, either you give up the idea altogether of writing a history of the Indian subcontinent, or else you have to say, these are my limitations and these are the reasons for the limitations. But I do accept the limitations, and I think that if one is writing a history of the subcontinent, you have to decide that you have to pick up the crucial features of all the different regions and bring them into the narrative, which is, of course, very difficult to do. Turning to some of the comments that you made on the writings of Vivekananda, Aurobindo and Gandhi, they were not writings concerned with the total picture of history at that time, or of India at that time. They were not concerned only with the history. They were concerned with specific aspects, many focusing on religion, and they were not terribly concerned with historical evolution. Now, in spite of the fact that I said that theory is very important and that one has to read people who discuss theory and analyze theory and so on, I think there is a distinction that has to be made initially when one goes into a subject between the history of that subject and how one theorizes on it. And I think, in a sense, many of these people were very sadly lacking in history. Whether it was Vivekananda, whether it was Aurobindo, despite the fact that Aurobindo was very interested in the epics, and Gandhi certainly was not a historian. Whatever else he was very great and did many lovely, very, very impressive things, but he was not a historian. I mean, when I read Gandhi's comments on the Gita today, it is amazing. It's not amazing, no, it's just typical of that whole generation. It's typical even of most people today who will absolutely not put the Gita into a historical context. They will pick it out as a book and they read it as in a vacuum, which is fine at one point. I have no objections to that. I think that, if a text is such that you can read it in a vacuum and get some meaning out of it, good luck to you, and get the meaning out of it, and let's all participate in that meaning and say that we agree or we disagree. But I'm just so amazed that there isn't to date a single book that says this is the historical context of the many of the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, and the many occasions when bits were added to it, and why were these bits added to it on different occasions. It's a fascinating story, and I'm too old to write it up now, but I hope somebody will write on the history of Gita. Anyway, yes, talking about nationalism and the communal interpretation, we must remember, of course, that all nationalism was not anti-colonial and all nationalism was not communal. We have come to the point where I think that historians are edging towards it, but not sufficiently. We have to categorize different kinds of nationalisms. Nationalism is the coming of an ideology that defends the nation state, and it's an ideology that defends the nature of the particular nation state that you want. And so you have Muslim religious nationalism through the Muslim League, which defends the idea of the coming of an Islamic state, and it more or less got that in Pakistan. Similarly, the Sikh idea of the Khalistan and the state that was ideologically based on the Sikh tradition, and also the notion of the Hindu Rashtra, which has been put forward since the time of Savarkar and which we're battling with at the moment. And the major nationalism at one point was an anti-colonial nationalism. Technically, theoretically, it was not a nationalism that was based on a religious ideology. We all know, of course, now, when we look back at the figures of that nationalism, that some of them were pretty close to taking communal positions. Now it is being reconsidered. I mean, the great euphoria that we all had as young historians about anti-colonial nationalism was secular. Now one is beginning to say, well, anti-colonial nationalism was largely secular, but it did have some people who had possibly non-secular intentions. I mean, to give you an example, there was K.M. Munshi, who was our education minister, the first education minister after 1947, who was the person who was one of the great sort of upholders and resuscitators of the temple of Somnath and the entire history of what went with that temple. I should say the entire mythology of what went with that temple, because of course when one begins to look at the history turns out to be very different. But it's a moot question whether you can call people like that essentially secular nationalists. I don't know. I think it's up for discussion and needs to be discussed. how does a nationalism seek autonomy, which is what it's always desperately trying to do in every variety of nationalism? It turns to history. And as I think it's Eric Hobsbawm who said, that history is to nationalism what the poppy is to the opium addict. That is, it is absolutely essential to nationalism. A lot of the nationalist ideology is based on how you reconstruct your past, because you're using that reconstruction of the past to legitimize the present and the future that you have in view of where you're heading. We make a big distinction between who we were, who we are, and history is a discipline which bases itself on this distinction as well. There are continuities, but there are also differences which historians are constantly stressing. And that is one of the reasons why we have things like periodization in history, where you assume that after a certain point of time there is a gradual change to another kind of society, and then there are problems with that kind of society. It evolves in particular ways and so on, and then it changes again to another kind of society. And that is what we mean when we talk about periodization. Let me turn to something else. Yeah, talking about the turn to communalism, one of the things that's always struck me as being very interesting is we should do a comparative study of India and China in the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, because there are very great similarities and there are great differences. The similarities being that religion in these two areas was not treated in the same way as Christianity, Judeo-Christian tradition in Europe, or Islam in West Asia. It was treated differently. Did this have an effect on how people thought about the nation and how people thought about the construction of the nation state? I think that kind of comparative study would be of great interest. There is also the question of the historical point at which there is a disjuncture. Now, I do believe that colonialism in many ways was a very strong disjuncture in many societies, including Europe. And this is something that we frequently miss out on, which is that Europe prior to the 16th, 15th, 16th centuries was very strongly linked to feudal states, feudal conditions, typically European. I'm not going into this very extensive debate that has taken place in Indian history as to whether we had a period of feudalism. And I think that, as I have written, I think the feudalism such as we had it was not identical with European feudalism by any manner of means. There were some trends that were similar, but that was about it. But it is the coming of the Enlightenment philosophy on a society that was recently feudal, which is breaking its feudalization and turning to something different in Europe. In India, on the other hand, however you argue that Enlightenment philosophy may have come our way, whether on the backs of colonialism or whether otherwise, it is functioning within the confines of an existing feudal society or a feudal type society. And I think that does make a lot of difference to the way in which these ideas are picked up and expressed. In the Indian situation, communalism then is specific to religious communities. The term communal, of course, is a difficult term because it literally doesn't mean with reference to religious communities. Elsewhere, it is simply a community. It is the identity of a community. Whereas here in India, it is used much more specifically with reference to religious communities. And these religious communities, let us also remember two things, that these religious communities were defined by Orientalist scholarship. These definitions did not exist prior to Orientalist scholarship, and colonial policy picked it up and made it much more definitive. In the same way as the majority-minority that you referred to, in some of my essays in The Past as Present, I have specifically said that this is an alien idea. That in fact the sooner we give up this idea of the majority community and the minority community, the better, because it is not consistent with a democratic function. You cannot function as a democracy if you have a predetermined majority and predetermined minorities. Majority opinion changes with each issue that is being discussed in a truly democratic system. The definition, therefore, of religious communities is something which has its own history. The first person to talk about the two nations of India taking history into the modern period was James Mill, who talked, of course, about the Hindu civilization, the Muslim civilization, and the British period. And that was the periodization of Indian history, and that was what gave a certain historical justification to the idea of these two communities, and continues to do so even now. I mean, despite all our efforts of explaining that this periodization is totally invalid historically, you still hear many people, responsible, reliable, well-read people talking about the Hindu period and the Muslim period and so on, which makes one feel very unhappy. But there it is. The definition, therefore, precludes the idea of citizenship. You are either a Muslim or a Hindu or a Sikh or Christian or whatever it is. You are not a citizen. You're not a citizen of India. And that, I think, is an important exclusion which we need to pay attention to in terms of theorizing about identity. And, of course, a lot of history, as indeed a lot of social sciences, are concerned with theorizing about identity. Historians of the ancient past seldom look at the present. That's very true. There is a tendency to think of the ancient past as a package out there, and you only study it as something, as really something that is the other. You don't quite integrate, which is perhaps part of the reason why you get the feeling that I, as a historian, am not talking about continuities, and I'm not talking about permanence, because there has always been the feeling that the past is another country, the past is something which is different. Whereas many of us have been trying to break it in our own small way, but not very successfully, obviously, because you still insist that one must talk about permanence. You're right. I mean, there are some things that do make for permanence, and we should perhaps stress those much more than stressing the change aspect all the time. But even someone like myself, where I have tried to link the past to the present, and in fact this book of essays, which consists of essays that I wrote over the last 40 years, the past as present. And I wrote them in journals like EPW and Seminar and so on, because they were not written for an academic audience, but for a general audience. I'm frequently accused of bringing too much of the present into the past. Now, this is an accusation that, one says, well, so where do you draw the line? There are some things which inevitably have a very, very close link, and there are others which don't. And so if you're dealing with things that have a close link, you have to bring the present into the past. And secondly, much more importantly, if you study historiography of any field, of any social science, why did the people who are writing write the way they did? What was the influence on them, both physical and immediate and long-term and intellectual and so on? You can't get away from the fact that there is the present in the past, in how you interpret the past. That is very important. The critique of communalism, therefore, is not just to expose the abuse of Indian history or to disagree with the periodization of Indian history, but also to show that there is a distortion, at least, if not a complete ignorance, of the methodology of history. And this is something that I've been arguing about a great deal, in the sense that history is no longer a collection of information from textual sources that belong to the past. First of all, the sources are huge and extensive. I was arguing with a journalist the other day who said to me, the Sanskrit department of the Delhi University has decided to devote the next couple of years to going through all the relevant texts to prove that the Aryans were indigenous to India. So this chap said to me, what's your reaction? And I said, well, my reaction, first of all, is that you don't start off with saying, I'm doing this in order to prove this. You start off by saying, I'm doing this to explore the question and see what kind of answer I get. But all right, you're doing this in order to prove this. Maybe. Have you got your definition straight? What is an Aryan? And I said, there are multiple definitions. So which definition are you going to pick up? And how are you going to defend that definition? Because you have to do that as well. And then you turn to sources. And I started listing the sources. All right, you go through all the texts, the Sanskrit texts. You also have to go through all the debates that have come up in linguistics on the meanings of individual words, constructions, grammatical constructions, and so on, in these texts, giving you clues as to whether they're all Indo-Aryan speakers, or are there some Dravidian and Munda speakers who are also reflected in the words and the constructions that are used in these texts. So you've got language, you've got linguistics. You also have to do environmental studies in order to find out which are the geographical areas where these people were moving and settling, because that is a very important consideration. And now, unfortunately, which is why many of us have given up working on this subject, you have to be something of an expert on DNA. Because you've got endless laboratories proving to you that this strain was Aryan and this strain was Dravidian and these were the Brahmins and those were the Kshatriyas and so on. What do we as outsiders do with this kind of DNA analysis, where there's such firm statements about who these people were? And it's the kind of situation where one says, oh, for God's sake, why don't they do some social science as well in their studies of genetics, to understand that you can't make these sharp distinctions and talk about these were these and those were those kind of thing. But anyway, that's one of the problems that one comes up with. Can societies change? Can they not change? I must confess that as a historian, my answer would be very simple, and that is all societies change. They have to change. There is no such thing as a non-changing society. In broad contours, yes, one can say that there is an isolated group living in the Philippines that is still in the Stone Age. It hasn't changed. But when you're talking about societies that are interacting with each other, coming and going, you've got towns and villages, and you've got all kinds of tensions, and you've got all kinds of settlements, negotiations and things going on, societies have to change. So I think that to ask a historian to consider a situation of non-change would be very tough on the historian, because it's just fundamental to history that you are looking at societies that have changed. And the whole question of periodization is a question of how societies have changed. I do love the Buddhist position which says that there is no present, because everything, the moment itself has become a part of the past. And I sometimes wonder whether this kind of attitude to time and to change was what really made the Buddhists very, very sharp historians, much sharper than other communities, the Buddhists and the Jains to some extent. But by comparison with the Brahmanical literature, there's no question that the Buddhists and the Jains did have a much stronger sense of history, and possibly all these issues came into it. But as an abstraction, of course, there are some aspects of society that are seemingly permanent. That is, that there are broad elements that seem to continue all the way through. But of course, as I said, one is also looking at change, and one is perhaps carried away a little too much by the desire to look for change. I think you have a point there. The identity, that's a very interesting question. The name, yes, Hindu is late. But there again, you see, like individual identities, like social groups, the identity of social groups, the identity of geographical regions also changes in terms of the label that is given it. And when you look at the label, then you start asking, why did it get this particular label? And if we look at the subcontinent or parts of the subcontinent, what do we have? We haven't deciphered the Harappa script, but there is a strong feeling that the reference in the Sumerian sources to the Indus culture, which is not a direct reference by any means, it's an approximate reference, may have referred to it as Melucha, which of course has been linked to the Dravidian Melakha, Melakhu, the Pali Melakhu, meaning places to the west, elevations to the west. And this has been linked with the idea that in the Indus cities, the citadel area, which is where governance lay, was always to the west of the residential area. But this is with a big question mark that I'm quoting this. What we do have evidence of is that it was, in the Ashokan inscriptions, referred to as Jambudvipa, Iha Jambudvipa, which we presume meant at least the northern Ganges plain, if not the whole subcontinent. How it came to be called Jambudvipa, we don't know. But anyway, this is a name. Then, of course, there are references to Bharatvarsha, which sometimes replace Jambudvipa. And then there are many references to Aryavarta. And what is interesting about Aryavarta is that its location shifts eastwards with each reference. In the Vedic text, it's much more the western Ganges Valley. In the Buddhist texts, it's much more the middle Ganges Valley. And in many of the Jain texts, it's much more the eastern Ganges Valley. So this is a case of how geographical identities move together with how the idea moves. And then you have Al-Hind, the Arabs and the Persians, the land across the Indus. Hind, which is, of course, as you rightly said, it is the Sindhu, which the Iranians referred to as the Hindush, and the Greeks referred to as the Indoi. And then the British come along, and for them, of course, the only source material for Indian history was primarily Greek and Latin literature, and so they read the references to India as Indoi in the Greek, and so they call it India. Now this is interesting because the term India, and it's linked of course to Al-Hind and so on, so there is a continuity from Al-Hind, Hindustan, India, there is a kind of continuity of thought. There is also the desire to evoke once again the Greco-Roman classical tradition, and remember of course that the British always assumed that they had the mantle of the Roman Empire. So this link with India via going back to the Greeks and the Romans also had that connotation as well, which we shouldn't forget. But I'm not terribly worried about identities because I think it'll change. It'll go on changing. I mean, you know, what's wrong with, the Lich were right. But on the other hand, what's wrong with calling it Jambudvipa? I think it's really much more poetic. Why not? Can you imagine what would happen in today's politics if we had to go around calling ourselves Jambudvipians rather than Indians? But nevertheless. I'm sorry, I'm going on for too long. Yes, I think I'll stop at this point.